Welcome to the Good and Basic podcast, a long-form conversation about the YouTube channel Good and Basic, with frequent forays into lots of other things. This time around, we're doing a foray into ancient Rome and lots of other related stuff. So it should be pretty good fun. We are Joseph and Joseph. You can find our social media information in the description / show notes. And so, well, here we go. Let's do this thing.
Yep, it's going to be good.
So here we go. Yeah, so Rome. So the videos we posted, we're kind of spreading this out. We realized we actually had quite a bit more stuff about Rome and Vindolanda and Hadrian's Wall and stuff like that than we thought we did, and so we're spreading this out over 2 weeks.
And this is from our trip to Europe, which we did several months ago. The first first very Roman video here is actually the one about the Roman shield.
Yeah.
And that one wasn't even filmed in England.
No.
That one was filmed in the Netherlands at a living history park called Archeon. And there we engaged in some speculative archaeology and tried to figure out why on earth the handle went sideways instead of up and down.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and then when we got to England, visited Vindolanda, we were actually there with Lindy Beige, with Lloyd from Lindy Beige, and so that was really interesting and
amazing. That was a once in a lifetime incredible experience. Lloyd, if you're listening, thank you. And yeah, that was incredible.
Yes, thank you. What was really interesting to me about it is that, well, it wouldn't be fair to say we came up with this, right? It's a pre-existing thing, but we sort of gave it the name, right? The interpretation game or the archaeology game, which is this process of picking up artifacts and looking at them and saying, okay, well, wait a second, what the heck is going on here? What is this thing, right? And we talked a little bit about some of the ways. Well, with Lloyd there at Vindolanda, we talked about some of the ways that can go terribly, terribly wrong.
Yeah,
right? Or terribly, terribly right.
And it's funny because in some things there's a higher degree of certainty, and with other things there's a lower degree. And someone who is not archaeologically trained like myself might actually be able to have an equally valid opinion because it's so vague.
Yeah.
And then if none of us are sure what it's for, then we just say it's for ritual.
Yeah, so that was the other joke, is if you find an archaeological artifact and you don't know what it's for, then, well, it's for religious ritual.
Yep.
And there you go.
Yep.
The joke being that, in some sense, that's not really an explanation at all.
Nope, it just means it's for a purpose.
It's
and
important and we don't know what
it is.
Yeah, well, and this is really interesting. This touches on a thing. We're going to talk more about the archaeology game and the interpretation in next week's podcast, but it touches upon something that we talk about a fair amount on the channel and on the podcast, which is that visiting the past is a lot like visiting a different culture.
Yeah.
Right. And if you're visiting the past of a different culture, then, well, it's a lot like visiting a different culture. And so, you find things and you're like, okay, well, but like I can do a chemical analysis on this. I can figure out what all the atoms are. I can there's all sorts of things that are easy to tell. But then there's all sorts of things that you look at it and you're like, what did this mean to the people?
Yeah.
What significance did it hold for them? Was it important? Was it not important? How did they look at it? And those questions are not easy to answer definitively, maybe not even easy to answer at all, but it's easy to jump into the game of trying to figure it out.
It is.
Which is really cool.
And it's valuable for similar reasons to why it's valuable to study other cultures. And that is partially to develop empathy and to develop appreciation for that which is different from you. And I mean, there's a tremendous amount of value there, and that's often the value that gets spoken of when they talk about learning a foreign language or going to visit foreign cultures or traveling as a way of broadening yourself. But one of the other reasons you do it is to get an appreciation for the universal. And so one thing that you can do when visiting foreign cultures is to say, okay, what does this tell me about the universal truths? They do things differently than me. My culture does things differently. But what does this tell me about the fundamental questions that both cultures are asking? Because when you see multiple answers to the same question, it helps you to understand that question better. And when you study, for example, the technology of another culture or of another time, and you realize they're solving fundamentally the same problems, they're just doing it differently and in a different context, it helps you to understand those problems at a more fundamental and, shall we say, good and basic level. And so there's something about broadening yourself and becoming less universal, and also about by doing the same thing, studying the past and studying other cultures, you develop more genuine understanding of that which is universal.
Yeah.
Or fundamental is a better way to say it.
Yes. Are we ready to talk about the end of the world?
I think we're ready to talk about the end of the world.
So
How's that for a segue?
I was joking about this with other Joseph before we started the podcast, that this is gonna, I'm almost kind of depressed to start the podcast because between the special podcast with Lindy Bage talking about fourth generation warfare, the Mos Maiorum, right, that whole question, are we Rome, like, this can all get pretty depressing pretty fast.
Talking about unspoken norms and their degeneration, and
yes.
talking about fourth generation warfare, and the idea that becomes decentralized. Like, there's a lot of depressing stuff there.
Yes. So we will try to keep our crushing morosity to an absolute minimum necessary, and maybe we'll even find some answers if we're lucky. So do we want to talk about the question, are we Rome, just a little bit? That seems like a good way. Do you want to... I kind of talked about your response to this question on the video.
I've been preempted. Let's do this.
But I'd like you to lay it out a little better. You're going to do a better job of representing your views than me.
So in high school, you and I took the same high school history class, and one of the textbooks that we were using was not actually a textbook. It was a work of popular history called Are We Rome, written by the same guy who does the Knight Valiant cartoon series, but his knowledge of history is actually quite good. The trouble that I have with this particular book and with the question, are we Rome, is that, like you mentioned, it makes me not sure what Rome is and also not sure what the United States is. I had the most bizarre experience. I served as a religious missionary in my early 20s, and I spent time in Holland. I was there for 2 years, and while I was there, people would ask me what life was like back home. And the trouble with life back home is, up to that point, I had never known anything different. And so I had a really hard time describing what it was like. What details would be salient for this comparison? I don't see it clearly enough to describe it. And then when I came home, I had the exact same problem describing Holland. So, maybe
it's almost like different experiences are different.
It is. And I'm not a particularly good comparer between them because I'm in them when I'm in them. And so I don't tend to see them super clearly. But, and then there's the problem with analogies in general, blah, 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 but in that they always break down. That having been said, the founding fathers of the United States Republican form of government, Democratic Republic, explicitly were looking at Rome as material for understanding what would happen with this massive experiment they were trying. And so as they're looking to found a civilization and try to create a stable government, can we do this? We don't know if we can do this. How long will it last if we do this? How are the ways that it's likely to fail? Like good engineers, they were imagining the worst possible fail conditions and seeing all the ways it could go down. And they looked to Rome and also Icelandic law and a few other places besides. But anyway, that's my problem, is that I don't know that I see clearly enough to... My trouble is, if I start making an analogy, I'm going to start lying. And I'm going to start molding facts and ignoring facts in order to make the parallel stick closer and closer. And for that reason, I worry that I'll leave things out and it will stop being useful and stop telling me useful things about... Because the reason you make a comparison like that is to understand both of them better. And
or maybe you think you already understand one, you just want to understand the other one better.
Yes. So if I understood Rome really, really well, then maybe I could use that to understand America, but that's not the order of operations when I'm actually looking at it. In actual fact, I will use modern politics to try to understand Rome, because that's the order that I'm studying it in.
Yeah, okay, so I want to say something sympathetic to that, and then I want to say something totally contradictory to that.
Booyah, do it.
So the thing that I want to say sympathetic to that is that, well, yeah, right? I mean, if you take the question literally, are we Rome? Is the United States or is anyone else in the modern world Rome? The answer is, well, no, Rome is Rome and the United States is the United States, right? So the real question being asked is, well, okay, is it similar enough that we can draw useful comparisons, and how similar is it and what kind of useful comparisons can we draw? And at that point, I'm like, well, I mean, obviously, right? There should be at least some comparisons you can draw, but, there's also some that you can't, right? Like, I mean, how much does it change things when you start changing the whole religious structure of that society? How much does it change things if you're post-Enlightenment? How much does it change things if you're post-Industrial Revolution? How much does it change things if you change the language, right? How much does it change things if you change the neighbors, right? And so...
How much does it change things if the upper class speaks a different language from the lower classes? How much does it change things if slavery's never been banned and there's no moral problem with it?
Exactly, right? So are we Rome? Well, of course not. Rome is Rome. The United States is the United States.
Okay, done.
Yes, but can you draw useful comparisons? So here's the thing: is that like, and if you ask me the question, is the United States Rome? My answer would be, well, no. Although there's a lot of similarities, but it's not clear how useful the similarities are. But does that make sense? I mean, my answer is not yes, but you can't help but look at it and be like, huh, there's some really interesting similarities. So in both cases, I'm going to describe this, and the fact pattern is going to describe both the United States and Rome, right? So you have a colony that is set up, and originally it's ruled by a king, but eventually they throw off the king and declare independence and create a republican form of government, and they chill for a while like that, and then they fight a couple of large wars with, let's say,
a massive foreign superpower.
Well, they fight a couple of large wars and emerge from those wars, first as a dominant regional power, and then finally as a superpower, and then finally as a hyperpower. While this all happens, what do their civil and political problems look like? Well, their civil and political problems look like there's wealth redistribution issues, there's citizenship issues, there's corruption issues, although that's kind of cheating because anyone can have corruption, right? There doesn't seem to be anything, right? Yeah. But citizenship and wealth distribution are really interesting, right? If we do weird stuff to reform our military in the next couple of decades, then that's I'm going to be holding on to my seat, right? Because that will echo the Marian reforms. So you can lay it out there, and there's some really interesting similarities there, right? Like that seem to be more than coincidence, right? In spite of what I said in the video about Mos Maiorum, like we do seem to have more in common with Rome than we do with, say, ancient Assyria, other than the post office. So apparently Assyria had a very well developed post system.
Well, there the connection breaks down.
You got to be able to do something right. Oh, they're the connection. Okay, yeah, very fair, very fair. Right. Okay, so that's the question, right? And I've kind of laid out, I guess, the strongest case that I can build why maybe the United States is Rome in some sense. And Mike Duncan, by the way, who's the author of The Storm Before the Storm, my impression from listening to interviews and listening to his podcast and reading his book is that if you asked him point blank, are we Rome? He would say, well, that's not a very precise question, and I can't really answer that. But he is very aware of some of these striking similarities, and I think they make him really nervous.
That's so interesting, because if there are patterns in history, then what that effectively allows you to do is to peer into the future, or at least a possible future that you seem to be headed on. Mm-hmm. It lets you look at the rut in the road that you're currently following and see where that rut has led other people before. Yeah. And so that can be an incredibly useful thing. The breakdown of a more decentralized, more independent system of government is really in favor of an hyper-centralized form of government in the form of the empire. And we think of the empire, funny enough, in mostly positive terms, I think. When people imagine ancient Rome, they're imagining mostly Caesar and just post-Caesar instead of the Republic. Yeah. But then you get, the later end of that. If you have power concentrated that heavily, all the incentives for exactly the wrong kind of person to get that power become very, very strong. And so you get the season of like the 7 emperors, where in rapid succession within a 10-year span, you go through 7 emperors through various backstabbing coups. Mm-hmm. And you lose political stability at the top. I am less interested personally in the political pattern, and more interested in the idea of moral decline. Mm-hmm. We did a podcast episode called Rhetoric, the Indispensable Art, where I made an argument that it's moral virtue or public virtue or something along those lines. Basically, people voluntarily deciding to keep most of the rules most of the time. Yeah. That is what actually holds society together. Yeah. And Rome seems to have been my impression, and I'm not as versed in this history as I'd like to be.
You would say, as Dan Carlin, you're a fan of history, not a historian?
I'm a fan of history, not a historian. I will say that. Dan Carlin, thank you for those words. But as a fan of history, my impression of the fall of Rome is that it's ambiguous. It's hard to point to an exact end date. I mean, people point to 476 AD and say, well, that's when, what was his name? Odoacer comes and conquers Italy and takes the temporary home of the government in Ravenna and ends the whole thing. But that's not really the end point. There's this long cascading decline where even people on the ground at the time are describing it as like, we are falling apart at the seams. And if it was just us in the present looking back and saying that, I mean, that would be one thing, the decline and fall of the moral of the empire. But that was the impression on the ground.
Well, and that's actually something mildly encouraging, and this is probably the most encouraging thing I'm going to say on the podcast today, so here we go, is that, you know, at least in the United States, and this is perhaps more true in the United States right now, but it's true in other places in the developed world right now, people are really spooked by politics. They're really spooked by the way politics is operating, right?
Sure.
And I think that that's roughly warranted. But let me say that's one of the things that makes me think, well, have we hit rock bottom? No, rock bottom is not even in sight. We're actually not doing too badly.
We're stable enough that political assassination is not common.
We have not had violence on election day.
Yeah.
Right? That's nice. That's really good. There are places in the world and times in the world where politics is adjudicated at the barrel of a gun. And you know, in the United States and in lots of other places around the world, that's not the world we live in.
Yeah.
And I do not care how corrupt you think Hillary Clinton was or how much you dislike Trump, right? Like, the fact remains that we have not shot and killed people on election day, and that is a really positive indicator. That's really good.
Yeah, it doesn't mean we won't, but we haven't. That's really
I was trying to be positive, Joseph. Dang it.
Well, I stole the thunder there. Funny thing, well, I mean, here's the trouble. So you bring up
my point is just that politics can get way worse and way more nasty than they are now.
So relatively
that's worth
speaking,
being grateful for.
We're doing okay. Or we're doing
so far
better than we could do.
Yes,
and that's
better.
good.
Yes, better than we could.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gosh.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Applying that relative scale is a very helpful thing for perspective.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, it also makes you want to like not freak out and kill anyone on election day.
Just so
because
that you don't
once
go further.
Yes, once you start doing that, it might get very hard to stop.
This is something I want to talk about in more detail because so you did a video called Are We Rome, which is mostly the video that we're spending the most time talking. That's the biggest single watching point for this podcast.
Yeah.
And you talk about the Mos Maiorum, which are the ways of the ancestors, the kind of unspoken rules that people just kind of follow. And if they stop following them, then it becomes unclear exactly how you're operating as a society. There are so many Mos Maiorum in, I'm going to use American law and politics because that's my background and my understanding, but these principles are going to apply everywhere. The principle or idea of Mos Maiorum. So an example, 9 judges on the Supreme Court.
Yes.
There is no law anywhere that says that there are 9 judges on the Supreme Court.
Correct.
That number is completely arbitrary, or rather has been established by custom. The idea that the Supreme Court can interpret the Constitution and strike down laws is nowhere recorded in law, except for what the court has said about itself.
Yeah.
And so that's an interesting thing. I can go on. The Supreme Court's power is purely one of we all decide to accept it. And there were cases like in 2000 with the election of President Bush. There was a case, Bush v. Al Gore, where there was a contest regarding the voting. And eventually it came down to the Supreme Court deciding who won. And you can imagine that, if it's an even vote, we're talking about 50-50 of the nation going either way.
Yeah.
That means that 50% of the nation said, yeah, okay, that sounds all right. After the court, with no enforcement mechanism, said, we think he won.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Purely on institutional credibility and custom, that we have said, yes, we are going to instill authority in the Supreme Court. And that's really all they have to enforce is institutional credibility. And there's been times in the history of the United States where we've drifted perilously close to breaking that Mos Maiorum. There was a case with the Cherokee Indian Nation cases versus Georgia. One of the cases that Chief Justice Marshall decided that the state could not enforce its laws over the Cherokee Nation. And the Supreme Court had ruled this, and then apocryphal saying, we don't know if this is actually true, but supposedly President of the United States, Andrew Jackson, said he made the decision to let him enforce it. I'm not doing it.
Yeah.
So right at that moment, we were at a point where Mos Maiorum could have broken down completely. So, I mean, we've been there before, and we didn't fall off the deep end yet then. So
this is something that I'm really curious about, is what do you do about that, right?
Yeah.
And And in my video, I was not very optimistic, and frankly, I'm still not optimistic. I think if you asked me right now to give my opinion, and I had to actually have an opinion, right, instead of trying to talk through the problem more, what I'd say is, yeah, you cannot escape that cycle. I don't think you can.
This actually ties us back into fourth generation warfare.
Yes.
Do you want to continue there, or I have something to throw in there?
I want to continue here real fast, if that's okay. So, oh shoot, what was I going to say? Oh yeah, so this is a really interesting question. Is, well, how do you turn that back, right? And something that I think about is the fact that, if I understand correctly, when Tiberius Gracchus gets clubbed to death on election day, that's the first time that violence really plays a role in Roman politics, unless you count kicking out the king back in 509 BC, and let's just forget about that for now. But during the Roman Republic, violence is not a thing that happens on election day, right, until Tiberius Gracchus gets clubbed to death in the Forum.
And not on election day. I mean, we try to avoid it generally, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes. Although election day seems particularly egregious, let's say, right?
Yeah.
So what's interesting to me is that, if I understand Mike Duncan's position correctly, basically what he says is, once they started clubbing people to death on election day, they could not stop. They just kept going back to it. So a few years later, someone else gets clubbed to death, right? And someone else gets shanked, and Julius Caesar gets stabbed, right? Tiberius actually has a brother, Gaius Gracchus, who later tried to continue those same land reforms. Apparently, what was it? He had a dream that prophesied that he would meet the same fate as his brother, and he actually did. He did. He got killed on election day too. So the point is, Mike Duncan's position seems to be once you start that cycle of violence, there does not seem to be a way to get out of it. Right?
Or not a rational way to get out of it. Because the rational thing for both actors to do, so let's say that you and I are fighting.
Yeah.
You suddenly change the rules on me in politics. Let's say that you're one party, I'm another party, and then you change the rules on me, and now I have an incredible incentive to level the playing field, because otherwise you're just going to win.
Yes, and that's
keep
an
winning.
unacceptable solution.
No.
Yes.
And so what am I going to do? So there's a game theory problem here where the rational thing to do is not the right thing to do.
Well, but what's so interesting to me about this, I agree, but what's so interesting to me about this is that in the United States, we fought a civil war. We've had some pretty nasty race riots. We're still here.
That's actually one of the things that I find the most beautiful about America, and that's that we have two constitutions, and they're deliberately at odds with each other. We have the formal constitution, which is it's called the Constitution of the United States, and it's a document that sets out the rules for how the government operates. It's a bunch of very explicit Mos Maiorum, which I guess are more
it would
law.
be Mos Maiorum, because specifically in Roman law, Mos Maiorum have to be the things that
Unspoken.
are not written down.
And you can't avoid having those. You can never write a system of law that's going to fill in all the cracks and leave no room for Mos Maiorum. But what we tried to do is make some of them explicit enough that we could point to them and say, nope, that's the law, you broke the law, you're going to jail.
Yeah.
And so that's the Constitution, right? It empowers government to do certain things and not to do others. The separate Constitution that we have is a declaration of rebellion. And that is ingrained in the American consciousness, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. And so all the people are sitting on this giant red button that says we have a right to destroy our own government. And that's the other half of our Constitution, which is amazing that we've managed to last 250 plus years on a self-destruct button.
Well, and the United States is not the only example of this, right? I'm thinking of the English Civil Wars, right? And I know, it's not as if England has had the same form of government for the last 1,000 or 1,500 years, right? But I think of the English Civil Wars too, and I'm like, okay, so they seem to have come back from the cycle of violence, right? And the United States seems to have come back from the cycle of violence. Again, we fought a civil war, and then, at least thus far, have managed not to fight another one, right? So I can't help but wonder about this, because Mike Duncan doesn't seem to be very optimistic, and I'm not very optimistic when I look at Rome, and I'm not very optimistic when I look at the nuclear option in the Senate or any of these other contemporary examples. But the United States does seem to have. The other places seem to have done it too, but how else do you explain that?
The brink.
Yeah, how else are you supposed to think about that civil war that the United States fought from 1861 to 1864?
Gosh, yeah. Well, one of the things that we did is we actually rewrote our Constitution after that Civil War. So the 1860 Civil War, we radically changed our form of government, and it's a distinct
correct,
thing.
But we still all recognize the thing that existed before 1860 as the thing that existed after 1865.
Yes.
Right? It's still the United States. We still regard George Washington as the first president. It's still the same thing, even though it underwent cataclysmic changes. We still regard it as the same thing.
Yes and no. One of the major differences is that we don't call it these United States anymore.
Yeah.
So the amount of centralized power in the federal government changed so drastically after the Civil War that we started referring to it in the singular, the United States, as if it were a single monolithic entity.
For sure, but what I'm saying is there were major changes, but we still recognize it as fundamentally the same entity.
Sure. I'm willing to agree with that.
Yeah.
In the same way that you are the same person that you were since childhood.
Yes.
This brings me to Fourth Generation War.
Yes.
One of the things that this cycle of upping the ante and rejecting the Mos Maiorum relates to, or seems similar to me, is revenge cycles.
Yes.
So in tribal societies all over the place and basically everywhere, and my understanding of Saxon law is not perfect, so please don't judge too much. But basically, you had family groups. You didn't have much of a centralized government, but you had family groups, and if person from family group A killed person from family group B, then family group B was obliged to take revenge on family group A. And this continued with tit-for-tat killings. The sagas, the Nordic sagas from Iceland are full of these stories. That's basically the whole story, is a bunch of these revenge cycles. But eventually you can get out of it by attrition, when both sides say, please, let's not do this anymore, let's find a nice way to save face, pay out some money to both sides, and just stop. And then who knows if that takes, and you actually manage to create peace. Or you marry off members into each other's families and say, okay, we're cool now, we're cool. Or, of course, you exterminate one of the families. So, I mean, these are kind of the options that you have to deal with, is make up and make peace, or pay up and try to make restitution and make peace, or it doesn't end until one or both sides have destroyed each other, which is a thing that can happen.
Yeah.
Funny enough, in the Book of Mormon, that's a major plot element, is that the end of the book is
fratricidal war of annihilation.
Fratricidal war of annihilation. Two cultures that can't make peace and eventually completely destroy each other.
Yeah, so here's an interesting thing is, actually, before I say an interesting thing, I want to say another interesting thing, which is about Audible, who is sponsoring this podcast. If you go to audibletrial.com/goodandbasic, you can, in fact, get a free 1-month trial of Audible and get a free audiobook that you get to keep even if you do cancel your trial, which is just flat amazing. But you probably won't want to cancel the trial because Audible is a really, really great product.
You've probably heard ads like this before. Because Audible is awesome, and they've sponsored a whole bunch of small content creators, which, again, is kind of an awesome thing, but that's more of a marketing business level thing. If you haven't taken someone up on this before, do it, please. You will really enjoy it. It's a product that we feel comfortable endorsing because we both used it before the opportunity to endorse it came
And in fact, we deliberately sought out the opportunity because we actually do really like this.
Yeah. So anyway, that's a full-hearted, non-forced support of
These
that
statements
product.
were not made under duress.
Not at all.
No, we really are big fans of Audible, and if you're interested in checking out, we highly recommend that. It's a great way to take advantage of a lot of your downtime. And in fact, you can get Storm Before the Storm on audiobook from Audible, and it is read by Mike Duncan, and he does in fact have a great
himself?
He does it himself, and he does in fact have a great podcasting voice.
Fantastic.
It's always great to have the books read by the author too. Yeah, so there's that. audibletrial.com/goodandbasic. Thank you very much if you're interested in that. So the interesting thing about fourth generation warfare. So fourth generation warfare as a theory was born back in like 1989. And one of the things that the originators of the theory did when they met together for their meetings was they said, hey, is there any way maybe that we could negotiate a new set of rules for dealing with terrorists, right? So they don't run by the same rules as us. They're very okay with suicide bombings. They're very okay with killing civilians. They're very okay with lots of stuff. Could we negotiate some sort of rules of engagement with them specifically? Kind of like the Geneva Conventions, but instead of governing the European, Anglo-European, Western way of war, it would govern the way that we fight with terrorists.
That concept is so interesting to me because when you think of war, you think of it as total all-out annihilation war. Talking with the enemy and setting up rules is stupid. Why would you do that?
Why would you inhibit yourself?
Why would you inhibit yourself? Why wouldn't you just use the tactical nukes and the anthrax and all the nasty stuff? Because it gives you the advantage, right? Well, here's the trouble. It is to your advantage now. it won't always be to your advantage. And so having some sort of mutually agreed upon rules that say we will argue and conflict in these ways and not in these ways is very helpful, just so that you can A, know if you're winning, and B, so that you don't get into the endless cycle of annihilation.
Yeah, well, and this is something interesting because, like you're saying, you would think that war would be an all-out thing, and the truth is that historically that is not the case. It's very rarely the case, I should say. Being a little bit more precise there. It's really not historically the case. And this is true cross-culturally, is that there is a way to do warfare, right? And the rules will vary from culture to culture, obviously, right? But it's not that easy to find examples where it's totally uninhibited, right? Even for relatively, like the tactical nukes is one example, right? Because you would think, well, the problem is if I nuke my opponent, then he will nuke me, and well, I really don't want to get nuked, right? But this is also true for lots of other things, like how you treat POWs, how you treat civilians, even things like invading other countries. Something that a lot of people don't know is that a large purpose of the Nuremberg war trials after World War II, if you go look at the list of charges against Nazi Germany, the first few actually don't have anything to do with the Holocaust at all. Instead, they have to do with things like, look, you have invaded other countries. That's not okay. We don't do that when we fight. We don't try to annex other countries. Massive civilian casualties. We're not okay with this carpet bombing thing. Right, and carpet bombing is a thing that happens in World War II, and there's, it's horrifying, obviously, right? But it's not part of the conventions of warfare for, a couple centuries previous to World War II. You don't go attack civilians. You attack the enemy army, but the civilians are off limits, right? And this is one of the reasons why, at least in the Western way of warfare, spies are treated differently than enemy combatants. If you're in a uniform, you are an enemy combatant. If you are not in a uniform, you are a spy, and we can hang you. Right. So even in cases where it's not obviously clearly a tit for tat thing, right? Where like I won't shoot nukes at you because you'll annihilate me with nukes. There's a lot of rules that get set up. We could use chemical weapons in the West and it would not be an existential threat, but we still don't because we regard them as basically inhumane and barbaric. And so if France ever fights Germany again, they probably will not use chemical weapons. And even if Russia, this is a thing, like when Russia invades territories around it, they still don't use chemical weapons, right? Even though it would not be a lethal threat, to them if it was used against them.
Because the trouble is, this conflict isn't the final conflict. This is actually kind of a funny thing because it relates to fourth generation warfare and Mos Maiorum, and all these things actually relate to the practice of law. Because one of the things that's kind of funny about being a lawyer is that you have a very high likelihood of running into the same lawyers on the opposite side of the case more than once. And so some lawyers develop a reputation for being hostile and using every advantage and denying any requests for extensions, and just being like, no, don't give them an inch or they'll take your arm. But that is something that is highly, highly discouraged because it makes the judge dislike you over time. And you can think of that in terms of military conflicts as being like, let's say, ally support or the home front eventually turning on you. And eventually, if you run into the same people over and over again, they have all kinds of incentives to eventually return that sort of rancor back at you.
Yeah.
And so over time, maybe it helps you to win this particular case. But if you play this game long enough, it will hurt you, which is an interesting thing. So thinking about your own best interests over the long term can lead you to be a much more civil lawyer. And there's a funny saying that civil lawyers, as in lawyers who practice on the civil side, tend to treat each other criminally, and that lawyers on the criminal side tend to treat each other civilly. And so that's kind of a funny thing, but hopefully the civility can spread over to both. Because it is in your best interest over time.
I've just thought of something else helpful to say.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is not all crushing morosity. It's just 90% crushing morosity. But I've thought of one other moderately hopeful thing to say, right? So I'm wondering about this descending cycle of antagonism and aggression, right? And it occurs to me that the sort of breakdown of the process that we're describing with the Mos Maiorum and the fourth generation warfare is sort of the mirror opposite of Piagetian games. No, excuse me, not Piagetian games, but this idea that the best game is the game that we can all play together for the longest period of time into the future.
Okay.
Right. So, one of the reasons why elections works as a game is because we all decide that whoever wins the election actually won the election. And even if we really don't like the outcome of the election, we're still going to say, yes, that person is president.
Yep,
Right.
even if you're the 49% that got outvoted or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah. Okay. Now, you can... So there's this underlying norm that binds you together with your opponents in that situation.
Institutional...
or
faith...
Or not institutional, but we agree to play by the same rules explicitly or implicitly.
Yes,
Yeah.
agreeing to the set of rules. So agreeing to the rules that determine win or loss.
Yeah.
And when we start messing with the rules, the Mos Maiorum, as the unspoken ones, that's the danger. But fundamentally what we should be is committed first to the institution before the position.
Well, maybe. I'm not sure if I agree with that. I'm trying to think. I'm not sure. But where I was, because I think you can reform these Mos Maiorum, these rules.
I agree.
Right?
They need to change, and so I don't mean a solid rock-like, never going to change commitment to the institution.
Yeah, but you try changing it and then see what the other side does is the problem.
Yeah.
So
if you do change, you need to be aware of the other side using the same technique against you.
I'm driving somewhere with this. I was going to say something hopeful, and the hopeful thing is this, right? Is that if fourth generation warfare represents the breakdown of underlying norms and rules for warfare, and if this whole Mos Maiorum issue is basically the violation of unspoken or spoken, perhaps, norms will result in potentially fatal instability. Well, then the answer is, couldn't you just go try to find something in common with your opponent, right? This is what the fourth generation people proposed is, well, couldn't we go talk to them and make some rules? Maybe we couldn't agree on some things, but maybe we could on others. What made me think of this is cancel culture. Right. So, and the particular example I'm thinking of is like a week ago, there was somebody at a college football game who held up this sign that said, Venmo me for beer money. Right. And it turned out that people Venmo'd him and he got like $1 million. Yeah, you're pretty great, right? Makes you want to hold up a sign like that at football games. So he gets $1 million, and what he ends up doing is he ends up donating it to a hospital, to some kind of children's cancer fund, right? So this seems pretty good, right? Someone goes digging into his past and pulls up some idiot tweets from when he was 16 years old, right, and rakes him over the coals, right? And Anheuser-Busch apparently was doing some kind of cooperative project with him where they were going to match the donation to this children's cancer fund, and they pulled out. Right. Yeah, they pulled out, right?
Based off of tweets when he was 16, after
yes,
he's already given the $1 million that were in his hands to the hospital.
Correct, yeah.
So if words before deeds, I mean, that's what they're looking at is words over deeds. This guy has just given $1 million to it. Wow.
Yeah, well, and here's the thing is, so why it made me think of this is that at least in theory, I could look at those tweets. I haven't read the tweets, by the way, so I'm taking it for granted that they were stupid idiot things to say, right? I can look at those tweets and say, all right, those were stupid idiot things to say, and I can still not hate him, and I can still work with him, and I can still live in the same country as him, and I can still, if I'm Anheuser-Busch, match his donation and work with him in that respect. So Anheuser-Busch basically said, look, we can't be associated with you because you're too toxic, right? And the answer is, well, all right, mister, and you know what happens when you start dissolving all the bonds that connect you with other people? Is you get people clubbed to death on election day because there's nothing holding you together. Right, so it seems to me that the potential solution, I'm not going to be too hopeful here. I really like the crushing morosity, but if I was going to be a little bit hopeful here, what I would say is, okay, well, if you could look at all the people, if you could look at all the people you hate and find one good thing about them, that actually might be a first step.
So Gracchus, if the Senate were to have talked with Gracchus and said, hey, we think you're being a tyrant, defend yourself. Before the knife came out, or before the chair legs came out.
Or here's an option, is just say, look, don't run for office, and we won't prosecute you. How's that? Done, done, and done.
You don't violate that Mos Maiorum, we don't violate this one excessively.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
There's one. Or to say, I mean, even threats. I mean, even if they're in the level of giving threats to each other, that still means they're talking.
Yeah. I mean, threats are still better than violence.
Yeah, because for one thing, it means the channel of communication is still open, which means you can understand the other person's position.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, what if you could...
Gosh, I can't believe I mean, on the relative scale, it's better than violence.
I know, right? Yeah, it's... So that's sort of my one crazy idea, is basically you would need to work to create bonds. And would you be successful? There is no guarantee you would be successful, right? I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that it's the only idea I've got, man. It's the only idea I've got, is if you could go, heaven help us, negotiate with the terrorists on some level and say, look, could we establish some rules of combat? You agree to not do some stuff, and we'll agree to not do some stuff, right? And we'll have some rules that bind us together. Then that might... Even
as we have unresolved conflict in the war itself.
The idea is basically to make it so that your conflict does not have to be universal and total.
Yeah.
You know, and like we understand this implicitly. Like, whoever your friends or your significant other or your family members are, right? Like, there's ways you differ from them, and you still have managed to not stab them in their sleep. Hopefully. Right. And so you've limited the bounds of your conflict, right? You've said, look, there are going to be some things that we don't agree about. But there are going to be other important things that we do agree about, and I'm going to stick with those and not let those erode as well.
Yeah.
Right. So that's what I got. That's Joseph Fisher's optimism for the day. You're not getting any more.
Joseph Bjork's optimism coming in for a 1-2 combo. So here's the thing that I find the most encouraging about the situation, particularly in American politics, and that is that I think that the virtue... The thing that's going to save us is instability. And here's what I mean. American politics is funny because we have a winner-take-all system where the Democrats and the Republicans emerge as the two giant parties. We have a two-party system precisely because 51% wins. And therefore, if you get close to 51% as a party, then the other people who don't feel the same way about you have all the incentives in the world to join together into a coalition, flying one banner to match you at least 50%. And if they can, to steal some of your voters, and suddenly you end up with two parties, back and forth. And this is just game theory played out. The thing about American politics, though, is that we don't have just two parties. We have two coalitions, and they change all the time. And so my perhaps naively optimistic prediction for the future is that both parties have been disintegrating. I mean, you can look at the left right now and say that they have a minority rights coalition that was brought together mostly by Obama. He just brought together bunches of minorities into his coalition. You've got the Greens, you've got the labor movement, you've got commies, you've got socialists, you've got the whole gambit. And these people are all gathered under one flag. On the Republican side, you've got the Tea Party movement and the big business.
Well, I think, do you mind if I interject? Because this is the exact thing I was saying about the Republican Party in 2016, is I was like, this thing is being held together by spit and prayers. Like, it's dissolving in front of my eyes. And it turned out it didn't, right? But there's still a very uneasy alliance between a lot of GOP membership and Trump.
Yep.
Right.
And so you can break it down into factions, and you can point to the factions and say, okay, the Tea Party votes very differently, and the Libertarians tend to vote more with the Republicans than otherwise. I mean, there's only 3 or so members of Congress that are really libertarian, and 2 of them call themselves Republicans in order to get elected. And that's Mike Lee and what's his bucket from Kentucky?
Rand Paul.
Rand Paul, and also Tom
Cotton?
Can't remember.
It's not Tom Cotton.
No, I can't remember.
I don't know
Thomas
if I would
Massey.
say that Mike Lee is... Well, whatever.
Well, he leans.
Whatever.
Anyway, so...
Not the point.
There's... it's complicated, and that's, I think, the virtue of this whole thing is that if the parties start breaking down, and they have, and they are, it is the internal instability of these factions that will help to recenter the Mos Maiorum. And so as these two parties tear themselves apart, you end up with new ones. And so if they were monoliths that would continue over time, then everything would just escalate out of control. But what I think is going to happen is that this escalation is actually going to cause them to decompose, recompose, and then we'll have a new stability. Yeah. And I think that's coming pretty quickly.
In theory, that they'd voluntarily recompose in order to keep winning elections.
Yes. So that's me being optimistic.
All right. Well, if you can talk about the end of the world as we know it, and end on an optimistic note, I would say take it. So,
whether or not it has any shred of truth to it, we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, I hope we come back to this at some point. Because I don't necessarily disagree, and no, I am. Well, what am I?
Are you still morosely pessimistic, or have you gained some optimism?
Yeah, both.
Okay.
Okay, so let's cut it off there. Thank you all very much for listening. Good times, guys. We will see you next week.
Thank you.